This is Mission Possible Inclusive Capitalism, the podcast show that fixes economic inequality, economically empowers Main Street, and has a little fun along the way. Hello, I'm Katherine, and welcome to today's episode, in which I'm rustling up not one, but two professors for you, Professor Larry Summers and Professor Peter Cappelli. So today we're going to dismantle the ruses that economic inequality has skyrocketed over the last 25, 30 or so years, with average American workers' pay not having increased stripping out of inflation because, number one, American workers just aren't educated enough, and, number two, because automation has been destroying jobs. Now, it's no surprise that the real chief drivers of economic inequality, Wall Street's equity investment managers and sell-side analysts, who meet every day with corporate America's top executives and force rationalization as strategy onto them, or what I call the great cost-cutting gig, i.e. shrinking to grow, in order to spin short-term unsustainable profit growth, instead of helping corporate America focus on sustainable, long-term, i.e. organic top-line, innovation-driven and inclusive growth. And they try to hide what they are doing by attempting to blow smoke around this issue and lay the blame for economic inequality elsewhere, including on workers themselves. And remember that unions have been declining over the last few decades is actually an irrelevant factor because Wall Street should have chosen to direct corporate America towards the right type of growth as above, which would have been far, far better for Main Street shareholders and pension fund beneficiaries because that generates far higher, stronger long-term growth and thus investment returns. But they didn't, because we are in a Wall Street primacy model, not a shareholder primacy model. Remember, 55% of American households are shareholders, indirectly or directly, through their pensions, 401ks, savings, etc. Anyway, so these Ivy League educated Wall Streeters' favourite ruses include, number one, that economic inequality has existed because American workers have a lack of good education. Come on, lazy old Main Street, get your skates on and go all get yourselves a lovely Ivy League degree just like us, or so goes their ruse. And number two, that economic inequality is because of automation destroying jobs. In fact, historically, automation has always existed and has tended to create more and better jobs than it destroys. So, funny one, Wall Street, nice decoy. And by the way, talking about nonsense and smoke and mirrors, don't forget that globalization and automation don't just happen in a vacuum. These are not naturally occurring phenomena that just fall out of the sky on us. There is no globalization nor automation fairy. Globalization and automation are trends that require agency, and those agents are corporate America's executives who are obliged to dance to the tune of Wall Street's investment managers and analysts. Now, as another one of my favourite professors, William Lazanick, points out in another one of our podcasts, these are just tools and you can choose how to use them, either to harm workers by continually cutting jobs, pay and other worker costs, or to help workers by reinvesting the savings of automation and globalisation back into what McKinsey Global Institute calls long-run productivity growth, i.e. into American workers training and upgrading their skills and therefore better jobs and thus better pay. So, I jollied up to Harvard to meet Professor Summers at his office, and later had a chat with Professor Cappelli to help blow through all this Wall Street blarney. Professor Summers was, of course, a former Secretary of the US Treasury, as well as former President of Harvard University. Professor Peter Cappelli is a leading labour economist and professor at Wharton, where he directs the Centre for Human Resources, and was previously a member of the US Secretary of Labour's Commission on Workforce Quality and Labour Market Efficiency, with a background teaching at Cornell, MIT, Berkeley, and Oxford University. Before we dive in with Professor Summers, let's just establish how the ground lies on a couple of issues: wage growth and bad jobs. First of all, regarding wage growth, it's really important to be a little bit discerning and to focus on real wage growth, i.e. taking out inflation, not nominal wage growth, because let's say nominal wage growth is 3%, but inflation, healthcare, food, childcare, rent, etc. has also risen the same or even more, then you're getting less for your wages. So real wage growth actually declined from around 2.3% to just under 0% from 2015 to 2017. And then it bounced back, hovering between a very paltry 1 to 2% measured year over year from 2017 to 2019. And since January this year, 2019, real wage growth measured month on month has been falling for production and non-supervisory employees, as per the data from the Bureau of Labour Statistics. As a comparison, by the way, on a nominal basis, in other words including inflation, wage wage growth has edged up to between 3 and 4% using a year-on-year rolling 3-monthly average, as per the Atlanta Fed and the San Francisco Fed. But this is still very low historically and compares with an average nominal year-over-year wage growth in the range of 5 to 14% from the 1960s to the early 2000s. So it's not looking very good either on a real or a nominal basis. And remember too, as Pew Research Center points out, that most of the gains have flowed to the highest paid tier of workers. Remember too that much of the job creation that we've been seeing is in bad quality jobs, with Wall Street preventing corporate America being able to create plenty of good jobs and instead forcing corporate America to crush worker costs as much as possible. So, for example, as Wall Street CEO Jamie Dimon pointed out, 40% of American workers earn less than $15 an hour. And 40% of Americans don't have $400 to deal with unexpected expenses such as medical bills or car repairs. Also, about a quarter of American workers are gig workers. And gig workers, by the way, are about 30% cheaper than full-time employees because they have no benefits and companies only pay them when they need them. Here are a couple of other statistics. Less than half of Google employees are full-time. And about 40% of Uber drivers depend on Medicaid, and about 18% of them depend on food stamps. A study by Policy Matters Ohio found that more than 10% of Amazon's 6,000-strong workforce in the state depend on food stamps. And lastly, about half of all Russell 1000 companies, that's publicly listed companies, fail to pay workers a modest yet adequate standard of living. Alright, let's go back to the supposed lack of education being the reason for economic inequality. It's a very fashionable assertion peddled by Wall Street that economic inequality exists because American workers just need to be better educated, and that will solve the problem that the average American worker hasn't had a pay increase in about 25 or so years, stripping out inflation. So let's kick off with Professor Summers, who pointed out that there is a fundamental lack of good, well-paid middle-class jobs and the lack of wage inflation in the broader context of the last 25 or so years.
Wage inflation in the United States is 2%. It has not gone up in 5 years. There are not 3% of the economy where there's any evidence of hyper-wage inflation of the kind that would go with worker shortages. The idea that you can just have better training and then there are all these jobs, all these places where there are these huge shortages and we just need to train people is an evasion of the problem. I am concerned that if we allow the idea to take hold, that all we need to do is there are all these jobs with skills and if we just can train people a bit, then they'll be able to get into them and the whole problem will go away. I think that is fundamentally an evasion of a profound social challenge. The core problem is that there aren't enough jobs. And if you help some people, you can help them get the jobs, but then someone else won't get the jobs. And unless you're doing things that are affecting the demand for jobs, you're helping people win a race to get a finite number of jobs, and there are only so many.
In fact, when you look at the hardcore numbers and the actual evidence, it quickly appears that the opposite is in fact the case, that American workers are actually too educated, they're overeducated for their jobs, and that the real problem is that there is actually a lack of demand for high-skilled workers. Just have a look, for example, at research by the New York Federal Reserve Board in a report called Analyzing the Labor Market for Recent College Graduates. I quote, "The percentage of college graduates who are unemployed or underemployed, working in a job that typically does not require a bachelor's degree, has accelerated since 2000. Moreover, the quality of the jobs held by the underemployed has declined, with today's recent graduates increasingly accepting low-wage jobs or working part-time." Let's take a look at the National Bureau of Economic Research paper, The Great Reversal in the Demand for Skill, which concluded that demand for college graduates since 2000 has actually fallen. Here's what they said. In about the year 2000, the demand for skill underwent a reversal. In this paper, we document a decline in that demand in the years since 2000, even as the supply of higher education workers continues to grow. We go on to show that in response to this demand reversal, high-skilled workers have moved down the occupational ladder and have begun to perform jobs traditionally performed by lower-skilled workers. Interestingly, the Atlanta Federal Reserve Board in its paper, Human Capital Currents, the Asymmetric Impact of Offshoring, pointed out that high-wage growth occupations have failed to grow since 2000. I quote, "Employment growth has been heavily concentrated at the bottom. That is, low-skilled jobs expanded robustly and the high-skilled group stalled." And then there is Larry Mischel, former head of the Economic Policy Institute, writing in the American Prospect, who pointed out, "The observation that there are multitudes of college graduates working as free interns should tell us that there is no widespread shortage of college graduates. Wages for the college-educated have been stagnant since 2000. Now, here's our good professor and leading labour economist at Wharton, Peter Cappelli. I think that we should have a quick chat with him about his paper for the National Bureau of Economic Research, Skills Gaps, Skills Shortages and Skills Mismatches, Evidence for the US. In this paper he wrote that the prevailing situation in the US labour market continues to be skill mismatches where the average worker and job candidate has more education than their current job requires. Concerns that there are problems with the supply of skills, especially education-related skills, in the US labour force have exploded in recent years. These complaints have not been examined carefully. The discussion below examines the range of these charges as well as other evidence about skills in the labour force. There is very little evidence consistent with the complaints about skills and a wide range of evidence suggesting that they are not true. Indeed, a reasonable conclusion is that over-education remains the persistent and even growing situation of the US labour force with respect to skills. By the way, when we talk about these trends, we're focusing on long-term trends, in other words, over the last 10, 15 or so years, not last month's numbers nor last quarter's numbers, because that tells us very little, if anything, about the longer-term structural dynamics. Also, there has been much made in recent months about wage inflation picking up, but in the bigger picture, compared to wage trends and the development of economic inequality over the last 25, 30 years or so, this recent pickup is really a tiny, tiny change. So let's start by looking at changes in the level of demand for graduates and the supply. If there's a shortage of something, the price usually goes up. Have we seen wages rise with this supposed skills gap, this skills shortage? What do wages tell us about whether or not there's actually a problem with the lack of skills?
The evidence that things have not been particularly good for labor. Wages have been pretty flat, and except for very few highly skilled positions, they still are pretty flat. I should say except for people at the very top of the income distribution. But for average workers, they're pretty flat. The average wages for college graduates, recent ones, have been not very good. They've been declining slightly, but still declining compared to where they were a while ago. So there doesn't seem to be any wage pressure.
In your paper, I believe you said that in the last 10 years or so, there's been a 31% increase in the number of graduates with bachelor's degrees and associate degrees, a 62% increase. So there's a very abundant supply. What do we know about demand for jobs with college-level skills? Has that been increasing over the last couple of decades or the last decade or so? Has it been declining or has it been static?
There's no great evidence of a big explosion in demand for higher education jobs per se. The jobs with the fastest growth are almost uniformly jobs that require no college. In some cases, like home health workers, they don't necessarily even require high school degrees. So if we're trying to project out and say, where will these jobs be in the future, at least the extent to which we can project, there is no evidence that it's disproportionately in the high education, high skilled area.
I believe you mentioned that some of the hardest jobs to fill are those that are in fact unskilled, such as labourers, etc. Tell us more.
Yes, that's certainly in some of these surveys when they ask employers what is hard to fill. Many of the jobs that come up are not jobs that are skilled at all.
Yeah, and so going back to this message that, workers, it's your fault that you've seen stagnant wages over the last several decades because you're just not educated enough. You're saying that's actually complete nonsense, that it's the opposite case.
Right. It's certainly not the case that there are good jobs out there for lots of people if they only had the education for them. That's certainly not true. And it's also, unfortunately, not true that if you just have a college degree, your life is rosy.
How much have skill requirements been changing over the last couple of decades?
The idea that today jobs require more college experience, it's simply not true. If you look at the answer to that question by what are the average skill requirements in the economy, they've barely changed over the last generations. Only very tiny increases in the average requirements of jobs. The average American has far more education than their current job requires. The evidence seems to suggest that they haven't changed very much at all. They've gone up only trivially and not really in the STEM areas. And I think this is actually consistent with research on technology change in general. We always believe that the period we're in has had the fastest growth in technology. Every generation believes that. But it appears that the 1960s had far faster technological growth than any of the decades since then. And things now, despite the fact we've got lots of new cool apps every year in order to send each other pictures, there's nothing in terms of technology going on that is really transforming the economy or jobs. What they complain about in students leaving school are mainly behavioral skills, not academic skills. They're not saying kids need more math. They're saying kids need to be able to show up on time and manage their work better by themselves. It's work experience. They want them to have worked already before they hire them, which, again, is not crazy for an individual employer, but if they all want to do that, then it becomes unsustainable. There is no evidence that the jobs today require more education. There's no real evidence that the jobs require more STEM skills.
Peter, you wrote that companies that are complaining about this issue, this skills shortage, actually have a poor understanding of how labour markets actually work. What did you mean by that?
The employers will say one of the big reasons why we can't fill these jobs is people won't accept the jobs at the wages we're paying. Well, that certainly has nothing to say about the supply of labor. It just has to say with the ability of the companies to pay the market wage. But I'd say the biggest point, which the pundits sometimes just ignore, is that this is a labor market and that you can find the people you want if you're willing to pay more for them. You know, the idea of a shortage, that there's just nobody out there to hire, is simply not true. You could pay more and you could find these folks. And typically that's how these conversations end when people tell me that they can't find people to hire. And I say, have you tried raising your wages? And they say, no, well, we can't do that. Well, if you can't do that, then it simply means that you're underpaying, right? It's like the car that I can't seem to find, well, partly because I'm not willing to pay enough money to get it. But whether or not you can fill a job doesn't just mean that it's because of the supply of people available. It depends in part on what you're looking for and how much you're willing to pay for it. So, for example, if I'm looking to buy a car and I tell you I would like a very roomy car that is very easy to park, and I'd like a very fast car that is very fuel efficient and with a lot of luxury features, but I don't want to pay more than $15,000 for it, and I can't find that car, you wouldn't immediately conclude there was a car shortage. You'd probably conclude that I'm being unrealistic in terms of what I'm asking for. And in many cases, that's what's going on.
Let's talk now about training. As Peter pointed out, a more important implication of many of the reports by employers about the supposed skills shortage is the underlying shift they represent in responsibility for the provision of a workforce. The notion that employers are responsible for training and developing employees to meet changing skills needs, which are textbook human resource concepts, is hard to see in any of these reports, even where the results show that employer practices are driving much of their perceived skill problems. In 1979, young workers received, on average, about 2.5 weeks of employer-provided training per year. In 2011, almost 80% had no training in 5 years.
Well, the standard part of business, and in any business curriculum, the human resource part of that program describes how you have to train them and develop them into the type of employees who can do the work that you want done. And so the employers have responsibility for this. There's pretty good evidence that employers have cut back on the kind of training they're doing, and there's certainly very good evidence that they're not developing and promoting people internally, that they're looking outside to hire. And it is true that they often have very difficult time hiring. Most of these jobs are ones that you used to fill from within, so it's pretty hard to find somebody who can step right into your unique job without some training. To what extent do employers expect to hire people and provide them some training or some ramp-up time or opportunities to learn your own systems? And if you drive those numbers down so that we don't expect to do any training, we don't expect you to have any ramp-up time, then you're narrowing the pool of people who could do your job down to a very, very small set. And in those cases, I don't think any reasonable person would say the problem lies in the labor market. The problem lies in unrealistic expectations about what you're looking for.
One thing I was very interested in is this concept that you were pointing out that, look, workers in a way are raw material. So it's actually a company's job to take that raw material and train it. And then from a competitive perspective, isn't it very compelling to highly train your workers because that's how you've differentiated your productive capabilities? Isn't that an important side of this?
In most organizations, the competencies that allow them to succeed, the strategy, is driven by internal organizational effectiveness. You've got to be good at something. And these days, the way you're good at something is almost entirely related to your employees because everything else is a commodity. You know, you can buy technology pretty much anywhere. Access to capital, access to markets and things are pretty much commodities. So you can get all that stuff anywhere, and all you've got to differentiate yourself is your employees and the way you manage them.
So, another cause of economic inequality frequently talked about by Wall Street talking heads is technology and automation. Here is Professor Summers to tell us what the problems are with this smoke screen. For example, if we've been seeing increasing economic inequality over the last 25 years because of increasing automation, shouldn't that increasing automation be showing up in stronger productivity, which is in fact the opposite of what we've actually been seeing? And remember that if we're looking to explain a phenomenon that's manifested over the last 25 years, such as economic inequality, then the causes of that phenomenon need to match or precede that same time frame.
I think there is a major puzzle there. I think it's very plausible to believe that technology has had large effects on relative wages, that it's substituted for workers in particular sectors. But if technology has been at an abnormally rapid rate so as to create an abnormally high level of displacement, you might expect to see that it would also have contributed to abnormally rapid productivity growth, and we've seen low productivity growth. And I think that is one of the major puzzles in making sense of our current economic data.
And by the way, I want to draw attention to some very important work by the Conference Board on Productivity in their report titled Prioritizing Productivity to Drive Growth, Competitiveness and Profitability. They pointed out that we are currently in a productivity crisis and that, and I quote, the main problem with productivity is not inefficient workers, but inefficient investments in production inputs. To fix this, they emphasize that companies must invest in human capital as, and I quote, strengthening human capital through continuous enhancement of workers' skills is a critical component of productivity improvement. They also call for an empowered workforce as a key means of fixing this productivity crisis. Back to Professor Summers.
On the one hand, we have enormous anecdotal evidence and sort of visual evidence of the kind that points to technology having huge and pervasive effects. You would expect it to be producing a renaissance of higher productivity. And so we, on the one hand, are convinced of the pervasiveness and far greater pervasiveness of technology in the last few years. And on the other hand, the productivity statistics for the last half dozen years are dismal. And any fully satisfactory synthetic view has to reconcile those two observations, and I have not heard them satisfactorily reconciled. And by the way, if you believe that technology happens with a big lag, and it's only going to happen in the future, that's fine, but then you can't believe it's already caused a large amount of inequality and disruption of employment today. What I have a harder time understanding is how there can be substantial disemployment ahead of the effect of the productivity. That is, if you thought that it just was impossible to put in these systems and so forth, then you might think that in the short run it would be a big employment boon because you'd have to keep your old system going, You have to keep your legacy system going, and you'd have to have 1 million guys running around figuring out how to put the new computer system in. So I understand low productivity, but I think it is hard to square low productivity and substantial disemployment. And I don't think the lags to reorganization story quite does it, because you shouldn't be getting the disemployment ahead of the productivity.
It's important to throw in a quick point here about a very trendy argument on Wall Street right now, which is that productivity isn't actually a problem because we're just mismeasuring it, and so productivity growth is actually very strong. A nice theory, of course, but not one that's actually backed up by reality, by the data. 2 great research papers by the Brookings Institution, Does the United States Have a Productivity Slowdown or a Measurement Problem? And the National Bureau for Economic Research, Challenges to Mismeasurement Explanations for US Productivity Slowdown. These 2 papers completely blow this theory out of the water. Okay, on to the next question. Here's what I want to get a better understanding of. What does history teach us about the effects of automation and technology and unemployment? For example, Brookings' Hamilton Project pointed out that historically, technological progress has tended to create more jobs than it has destroyed. For example, between 1900 and 2000, the proportion of the US workforce in agriculture fell from 41% to 2%. Yet there was no long-term increase in the unemployment rate. In other words, the automation destroying jobs and creates mass unemployment argument rests upon the false premise that there is a finite amount of work, whereas in fact, new technology tends to create new demand for labour. So Henry Ford's automation line reduced the cost of cars, which increased demand for cars, which in turn increased demand for labour and created new labour in new industries such as tourism, motels, restaurants, car mechanics, etc. Let's bring in another leading expert to help us understand this key point, Professor David Autor, labour economist at MIT, speaking here at the Brookings Hamilton Project's event, The Future of Work in the Age of the Machine.
When we think about how technology interacts with labor markets, we think in terms of substitution of labor with machinery. But in general, what is neglected is that complements us as well. Doctors have not become less valuable as medical technology has advanced, right? They can do more, diagnose more, and that makes them more valuable. One is whether the technology directly substitutes you individually or whether it helps you do one thing, it does one thing for you so you can do something else. So if you think about diagnosing, medical testing, obviously physicians can get a lot more information in the course of a day. The second is how elastic is the demand for those services. So if we are so much more productive in medicine, we could do all the medicine we did in 1950 in 10 minutes a week, right? And probably people would be healthier if that was the case, given the state of medicine at that time. But of course, as we get better at it, people will consume more of it, right? We spend more and more on healthcare, partly because there are many problems with our healthcare delivery system, partly because the services that we can produce are of much greater value. So there are many, many examples where productivity increases lead to growing wages, growing employment, and generally making jobs more interesting and more challenging.
I want to share another point that Professor Summers felt very strongly about when we interviewed him: inclusive prosperity and profit sharing with employees. In fact, he co-edited the report by the Commission for Inclusive Prosperity, which focused on ways to encourage greater economic growth with its benefits to be felt by the many, not just the few. And one of the key strategies identified included increasing workers' share of the economic gains via more extensive profit sharing with workers. As Professor Summers pointed out, this is actually really good for businesses because it's associated with increased productivity and increased profitability, citing research, for example, by Donald Cruz at Rutgers.
Certainly companies need to be managed in a way that reflects their own long-term interest and the long-term interests of the American economy. I've suggested as one device for helping to achieve that an increase in profit sharing so that workers have a stake in their companies being operated profitably. I think that will lead workers to be more supportive of increased efficiencies, and I think that has the potential to create a more equitable society in which when we have these periods when we're able to generate substantial increases in profits, workers are able to share in it.
Okay, let's finish highlighting the following points. Number 1, the problem isn't evil CEOs and boards. They have to dance to the tune of their boss, which they think is Wall Street, but it's not. Number 2, the problem isn't shareholders, because 55% of American households are shareholders via your pensions, savings, 401ks, etc. Number 3, the problem is Wall Street primacy. Wall Street are not the shareholders. They are just the managers of your Main Street's money. They are the servants of the public, to use Professor John Kay's book subtitle. Number 4, you, Main Street savers, pension fund beneficiaries, i.e. shareholders, want long-term sustainable growth and returns because your needs are typically long-term, running several years if not decades out. But Wall Street wants the opposite, to use your dollars and shareholdings to cash out as quickly as possible to benefit from themselves via their pay packets, etc. They take today at your expense in terms of both harming future growth prospects and returns and gigantic fees they charge you. Number 5, so they set the tune that corporate America has to dance to, and that's this caveman capitalism, this trying to shrink to grow indefinitely, which obviously isn't possible, this great cost-cutting gig, in other words, using the tools of globalization, automation, just-in-time scheduling, avoiding their responsibility to invest in worker training and worker productivity, which is the key driver of economic inequality. And that is exactly the opposite of what you Main Street shareholders need, because it is kneecapping companies instead of enabling them to be strong, long-term growth machines, as management consulting firms such as McKinsey and Bain have pointed out repeatedly, whereby companies are able to generate lots of sustainable, long-term and inclusive profit growth, and thus investment returns over the long term, which is your Main Street's time horizon, as well as your short-term income needs. And number 6, as one of the greatest business strategy legends of modern times, Harvard professor Michael Porter has said, operational effectiveness, in other words cost-cutting, is not strategy. Instead, he says, investors are supposed to enable companies to become strong growth machines by investing in their productive capabilities, i.e. workers. Number 7, in other words, the real agency problem is not company executives versus shareholders. It's Wall Street managers versus Main Street shareholders, as per John Kay, Stephen Davis, Jack Bogle, Charlie Ellis, and all the others. In other words, it's your money, Main Street, not Wall Street's money. So what are we doing about this mess? Well, we've created a public advocates for optimizing capitalism to give you, Main Street, back your economic power, your economic voice, and your economic influence, to let you make the choice. Stop this caveman capitalism, which is the key driver of economic inequality, being done in your name with your dollars and costing you a lot because it's lowering long-term growth and therefore lowering long-term investment returns on your money. Or choose smarter capitalism, i.e. sustainable, long-term growth-oriented and inclusive capitalism. So we have to get the attention of corporate America, hello chaps, and get them to stop paying attention to the anti-capitalists on Wall Street, which will be quite hard because breaking habits can be a bit tricky, but with some good old American grit, not impossible, because it's, number 1, not Wall Street's money, it's yours, Main Street, and number 2, we have academia with us on this issue, and entities such as McKinsey and other business practitioners, as well as corporate America executives themselves who are so bored rigid with all this caveman capitalism malarkey. So, if you want to take back capitalism from Wall Street, if you want smart capitalism instead of caveman capitalism, if you want capitalism to be on a path of stronger, higher, sustainable and inclusive growth, then lend us your support by following us, tweeting us and retweeting us and signing our 3 petitions on our website, yourcapitalism.com, and following us and joining us on this journey. So, it's your money propping all this up, it's your capitalism, so what are you going to do about it? Alright, to wrap up, I would like to thank Professor Summers and Professor Cappelli, and also the Brookings Institution's Hamilton Project. And finally, I would like to thank our soprano Erica, whose serenely beautiful dulcet tones you have been listening to throughout this podcast and others, and our equally fine lyric tenor Stephen and bass Chris. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Ba-da-da-da-da-ba.